They built armies across a desert no one crosses anymore. For 3 decades that lined 1,500 kilometers of sand. Salt and suspicion has been closed to trade, closed to families, closed to normal life. It looks on a map like a straight border. In reality, it is a scar left by empires, stitched with treaties that never healed. And lately that wound has begun to bleed again. To understand why 2 countries who share language, faith and a long coastline are now staring down the possibility of direct confrontation, we have to go back to how modern North Africa was carved up by outsiders who drew lines for their own convenience and left. People living on the wrong side of someone else's pencil. When Algeria emerged from a brutal colonial war in 1962 and Morocco came into independence a few years earlier, their maps didn't match. What seemed like an administrative oversight became an emotional grievance, claims and counterclaims, each side insisting history and honor were on its side. Those early disputes exploded into the Sand War in 1963, a brief but bitter clash that proved how thin the veneer of post-colonial civility could be. A ceasefire came, but distrust lingered like dust on a shelf. Both capitals learned a lesson that would define their behavior for decades. The frontier had to be guarded, and the enemy must be watched. What followed was less about pitched battles and more about accumulation of weapons, of influence, of diplomatic allies. Treaties and public smiles were one thing. Behind the scenes, military posture and strategic patience became the rule. Then, when Spain abandoned Western Sahara in 1975, the fragile order snapped. Spain left a vacuum over a vast strip of desert and a people who never asked to be pawns in someone else's deal. Morocco moved quickly. The Green March, hundreds of thousands of civilians, walking south with flags and couronzoirs, a show of popular claim that forced Madrid to negotiate. The result was a transfer of administrative control and a territory effectively claimed by Rabat. It looked like a diplomatic victory on the surface. But that move ignored the Sahrawi people who lived there and wanted self-determination. They refused to be subsumed. Out of that refusal rose the Polisario Front, a liberation movement with a simple demand: an independent state for the Sahrawi people. Algeria saw in the Polisario more than sympathy. It saw a strategic counterweight to what it viewed as Moroccan expansionism and an opportunity to limit Rabat's influence. Algeria gave the Polisario sanctuary, arms, and diplomatic cover. The Sahrawi leader declared a government in exile, and camp-tent cities in the Algerian desert became permanent homes for generations. 3 generations have now lived in limbo, citizens of no internationally recognized state, holding on to a promise of a referendum that never arrives. By the 1980s, the conflict had calcified into a frozen war. Morocco consolidated control over most of the territory and built a massive berm, miles of sand walls, minefields and sensors to hold what it controlled. The Polisario held the eastern, empty spaces. Algeria provided a rear base and international recognition. The United Nations brokered a ceasefire in 1991 and framed a referendum as the solution. But the 2 sides could not agree on who would be eligible to vote. The referendum stalled, and the political problem ossified into a long, bitter impasse. What remained was a diplomatic battlefield stretching from the UN hallways to African capitals. Over time, this local dispute took on regional and even global dimensions. Morocco's position hardened into an existential policy. Western Sahara was part of the kingdom, non-negotiable. Algeria framed its support for the Sahrawi cause in anti-colonial terms and as a defense of people's rights. Each state began to rally partners' recognition for the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic in some capitals, and in others efforts to roll back that recognition. The battle for legitimacy moved from the desert to the halls of the African Union and into embassies worldwide. Morocco even withdrew from the AU's predecessor for decades over the issue. When it returned in 2017, it meant to contest the narrative from inside. But diplomatic schisms are brittle when energy and economics enter the frame. Algeria sits on vast gas reserves and, for years, supplied Europe and the Maghreb. Morocco has relatively little hydrocarbon wealth and long relied on transit fees and regional ties. For a while, pipelines and commerce softened the adjust's practical needs, forcing grudging cooperation. Yet energy can also be wielded like a blade. When politics soured, the pipelines that once linked economies became leverage. The old habits of trans-Maghreb cooperation gave way to competition and, in time, to rupture. The freeze cracked fully in 2020. A flare-up at a remote border crossing in Guerguerat saw the Polisario block a key trade route. Morocco sent troops to reopen the corridor. The Polisario declared the ceasefire over. Within weeks, a geopolitical domino fell. One of the most consequential moves came from an unexpected place, the Oval Office. In December 2020, the United States formally recognized Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, part of a broader diplomatic package that included Rabat's normalization with Israel. That recognition was a seismic shift in diplomatic winds, and to Algeria it looked like an orchestrated sidelining of Sahrawi claims and a strategic win for Morocco. The region's balance was changing. Surveillance scandals and covert tensions followed. Reports emerged alleging state-grade spyware was used to target officials and journalists, feeding mutual paranoia. Accusations flew that each side was cultivating proxies inside the other support for separatist movements. Diplomatic pressure, and increasingly, an arms build-up. Algeria's military budget surged in the last several years, outpacing its neighbor and transforming the Maghreb into a new security flashpoint. The figures are stark. Algeria's defense spending rose sharply and made it one of Africa's largest military spenders, while Morocco focused on technical upgrades and precision systems. That gap is not just numbers on a page, it changes the strategic calculation across the region. Tensions hardened in 2021, amid allegations, counter-accusations, and a climate of mistrust. Algeria cut some of the old economic ties that once provided both sides a measure of mutual restraint. Most notably transit arrangements that had flowed for decades. Energy routes were rerouted, partnerships paused, and both capitals began new defense procurement. The Maghreb, once the idea of regional unity, was fragmenting into rival camps, buying weaponry and alliances from different global powers. Russia, China, and others moved closer to Algiers. Rabat leaned toward Western partners and new security suppliers. The contest, once localized to the Sahara, had become entangled with broader geostrategic currents. This is where the danger lives. The dispute is not only about maps or minerals or a disputed sliver of sand. It is about dignity and memory, alliances and leverage, the politics of recognition and the economics of energy. And layered on top of all that is a simple and sobering truth. Even small mistakes in tense places can snowball. One misfired strike, one misread order, one escalation at a border post can ignite a broader clash neither side wants. For now, deterrence and diplomatic pressure still hold voices urging calm, regional organizations urging restraint, but the armories have been filled and the rhetoric has hardened. The question we must ask is not whether this rivalry is old, it is whether the world has learned how to prevent an old rivalry from becoming a new war. The deeper this rivalry digs, the more it exposes the fault lines, not only between two nations, but to entire worldviews. The end of the 20th century had offered them an opening, a brief pause, a moment of possibility. As Europe rebuilt trade, as the Cold War froze into history, some believed the Maghreb might finally unify. Yet, Algeria and Morocco found themselves trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape. When the Cold War faded, so too did the ideological clarity that once defined their sides. But the ghosts remained. Algeria still saw itself as the revolutionary bulwark, a republic of resistance born from anti-colonial struggle. Morocco, on the other hand, cast itself as the model of modern monarchy, stable, Western-aligned, a bridge between Europe and Africa. Both roles gave their leaders legitimacy at home and leverage abroad, yet both carried seeds of paranoia. The optimism of the 1990s, that fragile spark of détente, was short. After the Marrakesh bombing in 1994, the border was sealed, not just physically, but psychologically. Generations have now grown up on either side of that 1,500-kilometer divide, never having seen what lies beyond it. Families split, trade routes forgotten, and mistrust institutionalized. By the 2000s, a new currency emerged: energy. Oil and gas began shaping global alliances, and in North Africa, that meant power. Algeria was blessed with abundance, the 11th largest gas reserves on Earth, a major supplier to Europe. Morocco, meanwhile, had geography sitting perfectly between Algeria's pipelines and Europe's hunger for energy. For years, that interdependence was delicate but functional. The Maghreb-Europe pipeline, opened in 1996, symbolized cautious coexistence. Algerian gas flowed through Moroccan land into Spain. Everyone gained something, but the relationship was brittle. Every trade dispute, every maintenance delay, became political. Behind every handshake was a hidden frown, and by 2018, the smiles had vanished altogether. Then came the spark that reignited the Cold War. In late 2020, a flashpoint erupted in the barren sands of Guergueret, a dusty border crossing at the edge of Western Sahara. Polisario fighters, supported by Algeria, blocked the route, halting convoys that connected Morocco to West Africa. Rabi responded with troops, claiming it was a security operation. To Polisario, it was a breach of the ceasefire. In an instant, 30 years of uneasy calm dissolved. Gunfire echoed across the dunes. And then, the diplomatic earthquake. December 2020, in one of the final acts of the Trump administration, the United States formally recognized Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara. In exchange, Morocco normalized relations with Israel, joining the Abraham Accords. It was a deal that redrew the strategic map overnight. For Rabi, it was validation. For Algiers, humiliation. Suddenly, Morocco's ties with Israel were not symbolic. They were tangible. Military cooperation, intelligence sharing, drone technology, all began flowing across the Mediterranean. To Algerian generals, this was the ultimate betrayal. Their historic rival now hosting Israeli-made surveillance systems right next door. A year later, the Pegasus scandal exploded. Investigations revealed that Moroccan intelligence had allegedly used Israeli spyware to target Algerian officials, journalists, and even senior figures in government. Rabi denied it, but for Algeria, the damage was done. Trust was shattered beyond repair. That same summer, when Morocco's UN envoy suggested that Algeria's Kabylie region, home to Berber minorities, deserved self-determination, the line was crossed. It was a diplomatic grenade. Algeria recalled its ambassador within days. Weeks later, fires tore through northern Algeria, devastating forests and killing scores of people. The government accused Moroccan-backed separatists of involvement. Whether true or not no longer mattered. The emotion had taken over. On August 24, 2021, Algeria severed diplomatic relations with Morocco completely. Embassies closed, flights cancelled, borders, already sealed, became unbreachable walls. And in the shadow of this new hostility came something darker. Reports emerged that Algerian truck drivers were killed in a suspected drone strike near the Western Sahara border. Morocco said nothing. Algeria called it murder. By the year's end, the message was clear. The cold peace had ended. That same autumn, Algeria played its most potent card, energy. For decades, the Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline had been the artery connecting both nations' economies. On October 31, 2021, Algeria cut it off. No more gas flowing through Moroccan soil. No more transit fees. No more cooperation. Overnight, Morocco lost nearly 10% of its power supply. Algeria rerouted everything through a new undersea line to Spain, bypassing Morocco entirely. It wasn't just an economic move. It was a statement, a declaration that interdependence was over. And the irony, while both nations weaponized pipelines and gas, Europe was watching. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the entire continent scrambled for new energy sources. Algeria suddenly became a prized partner, courted by France, Italy, and Germany. Western diplomats flooded Algiers, offering contracts and praise. Morocco, left out of this new gas rush, turned toward the Atlantic, exploring offshore gas, courting British investors, and advancing the Nigeria-Morocco pipeline project. Once again, rivalry found a new stage, not the battlefield, but the global energy market. But while Europe saw Algeria as a solution, Algiers saw itself as a rising power, one that could no longer be ignored. Flush with gas profits, the government poured money into its military. Between 2020 and 2024, defense spending more than doubled from under $10 billion to over $21 billion. Algeria became Africa's largest arms buyer, investing heavily in Russian fighter jets, Chinese drones, and advanced missile systems. Morocco responded differently. Smaller budget, smarter shopping, US-made F-16s, Turkish Bayraktar drones, Israeli reconnaissance technology. Each acquisition told a story. Two nations preparing not for peace, but deterrence. Every base expanded, every new weapon announced, became a message, a warning. Not yet war, but not far from it either. Then came the joint drills. In 2022, Russian and Algerian troops conducted exercises on Algerian soil, reportedly near the Moroccan border. In Washington and Brussels, alarms rang. NATO analysts whispered about a Mediterranean front. Algeria brushed off the criticism, calling it routine cooperation, but everyone knew it was anything but routine. As 2023 and 2024 unfolded, the rhetoric hardened. Western think tanks warned that the Maghreb was slipping into a cold war of the deserts. On social media, the conflict played out in miniature maps, memes, manipulated footage, a digital battlefield mirroring the one in the dunes. By early 2025, Algeria took its most dramatic legal step, a general mobilization law. Officially, it was designed to strengthen the army's response to terrorism in the Sahel. But everyone understood the subtext. The law gave the government power to move troops, commandeer civilian infrastructure, and transition the nation into wartime readiness within days. Moroccan commentators called it preparation for war. Algerian newspapers called it sovereignty. But the tension was unmistakable. Meanwhile, across Western Sahara, the fighting simmered. Polisario forces launched sporadic attacks, while Moroccan drones patrolled the skies with lethal precision. Civilians fled the desert camps that had stood for nearly half a century. Young Sahrawis born into sticklessness began losing faith in diplomacy altogether. The landscape that once symbolized promise now echoed despair. Trenches, drone hums, endless sand. Both governments claimed legitimacy. Both claimed to be on the right side of history. Yet, neither can see beyond the horizon of their own pride. What began as a post-colonial border dispute has mutated into something far more complex, an ideological standoff, an energy chess game, and a reflection of global realignment. Morocco's alliances with the West and Israel give it modern technology and international recognition. Algeria's partnerships with Russia, China, and Iran give it weapons, leverage, and energy power. Two systems, two narratives, one region divided, and at the heart of it, millions of people caught in between. Families who haven't crossed the border in 3 decades, refugees who've never known citizenship, children born in camps that were never meant to last this long. Experts insist war is unlikely, the costs are too high. But history has a cruel sense of irony. Wars rarely begin with grand declarations. They start with a drone, a convoy, a misread signal, a single decision that spirals out of control. So perhaps the question isn't whether Morocco and Algeria will go to war, but whether they can continue living like this without one. Because every weapon bought, every speech made, every closed gate across that silent desert, it all brings them one heartbeat closer to the edge. And if that line is ever crossed, it won't just redraw the map of North Africa. It will redraw the balance of power for the entire Mediterranean. Because when giants in the desert move, the world listens.